I want you guys to leave this webinar feeling really confident in tackling what it means to actually create a podcast episode. Now, not only does that mean what the title says, right, from raw audio to polished podcast, but it actually means even more than that, because creating an episode has these elements of planning that you really need to get a good handle on before you actually press record. So we're going to be covering all of that. And I'm going to dig into those details in just a bit. But I did want to mention that this is the second of 4 webinars that Spreaker is doing. It's our Podcasting from A to Z webinar series. Now, I do want to mention, if you missed webinar 1, don't sweat it at all. This content in webinar 2 stands alone and is going to be very beneficial to you. And I do want to mention that the podcasts we have coming up the webinars that we have coming up, number 3 is going to be all about promotion. And number 4 is going to be all about monetization. So now that you're looped in with us, I hope that you will find today helpful and that you'll also join us as we go forward. Now, stay tuned until the very end of the webinar, as I'll be announcing our next webinar date, the promotion webinar, where we'll be talking about everything from creating an online presence to pitching yourself to the media, everything about promotion. Now, I do just want to let you know the format of this webinar. In short, we're going to be covering content for about 40 to 45 minutes. I'm going to be sharing all of our best tips and tricks on the creation process, and then we'll move into a 15-minute Q&A period. So I do just want you to make sure that you're utilizing the chat to drop your Q&A information, okay? So I have a wonderful moderator helping me today, Yvonne, and she is going to be going through the chat throughout the entire webinar and pulling back your questions so that we can answer in the end. Be sure to ask questions related to the content, and we will absolutely address all of those things in the end. Okay, this webinar is packed full of useful content. So whether you're an individual podcaster or you work for a podcast company, you are going to leave this webinar feeling extremely confident in these 5 things. You're going to know how to draft an episode outline. You're going to know how to find guests for your podcast if you have guests on your podcast. You're going to know the right recording equipment and editing software for you. And then you're going to have a bunch of tips and tricks and ideas of how to really move into the recording and editing process, fully equipped to do it your best. And then lastly, you're going to have a full understanding of hosting and distributing your podcast. Now, before we jump in, very quickly, I want to share with you who we are. We are Spreaker. We are an all-in-one digital platform for hosting, editing, distributing, and monetizing your podcasts. You can do all of those things on our website or on our app, Spreaker Studio. So no matter who you are, if you are a brand new podcaster looking to monetize, or you are a podcast company that has thousands of episodes and podcasts, we have a service for you to help your podcast succeed. And I do just want to take a moment to introduce myself. Hello, my name is Ivy. I am your webinar host. I am Spreaker's PR and media specialist, and I am in charge of a lot of our education here. I'm very passionate about podcasting. I've been involved in the space and a big fan of podcasts since 2014, since Serial, kind of the OG podcast that really started to grow the industry. And over the last 7 years of my career, I've spent my time helping brands and individuals truly learn how to communicate who they are. So I hope to bring my expertise to you today, because communication is an important element of every piece of your podcast, and I'm excited to share with you. Now, I did not produce this alone. I had a lot of help from people within Spreaker. Tonya Maffeo, she's our head of marketing. Spreaker's been around for a decade, and Tonya has been here sending podcasters. It's amazing. But he also has worked on tons of other audio projects, and he really has a unique gift of knowing how to tell stories through audio. So thank you to all of them, or the two of them, for contributing. You are in good hands with the information we're going to share today. Okay, here we go. So we're going to jump in where we left off on the last webinar. Again, if you weren't here for webinar 1, it's no big deal. Okay, I'm hearing that I might be frozen. Can you guys see me? Okay, all right, great. Looks like we're good. Okay, cool. Okay, hopping back in. Okay, so we're gonna leave where we left off last time. Again, if you weren't here for webinar 1, it's no big deal, but I wanna mention it because once you get to this point where you're drafting an episode outline, you should already have a few things solidified. And that's your podcast name and concept, your podcast format, your podcast art, and your podcast introduction. Those are the things that we chatted about in our last webinar. So again, no worries if you haven't determined those things yet, but so that you have a clear path for yourself, make sure that you touch on, you really work through those items before you dig into developing your content. Okay, so once that brand is solidified, you can really start thinking about what should be in your episode. Why would you want to develop an outline? Well, you want to make sure that your content is high quality, right? Your branding and your promotion is how you bring in listeners initially, but in order to keep listeners coming back, you have to produce high quality, organized content, and developing a proper structure is really going to help you do that. So I'm just going to quickly go through this section. The first step is the brainstorming and research step. So I want you to ask yourself these questions as you're developing an episode outline. What is the purpose of this episode? Okay, you've already done your branding and your probably have a mission for your podcast overall, but your individual episode also needs a purpose. Ask yourself what the hook is to get listeners interested. Okay, so at the beginning of the show, you want to have something that is tantalizing, something that's really going to catch your listeners' attention. So when they hear those first 30 seconds, they're like, oh, I want to stay. I want to stick around for this. Question number 3 is you need to ask, what subject matter do I need to get more familiar with? Are there any specific events or stories I need to know about, right? So this is where you really dive deep into specific topics, doing your research online, go into the library, however you research. You really want to flesh out all the knowledge that you need. And then last but certainly not least, as a host, it's your duty to really be able to facilitate conversations if you're having conversations with co-hosts and guests. So make sure that you really know the background of your guest or your co-host so that you can speak to them easily and make things flow. Okay, after that, you're going to jump into the actual episode outline. So this is the ideal structure. Of course, it depends on your format. It might slightly tweak depending on what kind of podcast you have, whether it's a solo podcast or an interview podcast or a storytelling fiction podcast, right? So things vary a little bit, but this is the general structure. Introduction, you want to be able to succinctly introduce yourself, introduce the podcast. Up next is the episode summary. You want to be able to include within this that hook that we talked about in the research and planning. You want to be able to loop in what the episode is about and why listeners should stick around for it. Next, you want to introduce your guests or maybe your co-host. And then I wanted to make sure to include this part because I think segues or transitions are one of the more challenging things if you don't have experience presenting or podcasting or speaking, because you have your main points, right? You know what you're there to talk about. But with podcasting, it's actually really vital to figure out those sentences or paragraphs or concepts that will help you bridge the gap between idea 1 and idea 2, because you want things to flow smoothly. So it's something that I really encourage you to specifically plan out. Then you're going to move into all the main points, right? Your main topic, your secondary topic, and then if you have a tertiary topic or point, you would bring that up. Then next up is your conclusion. You want to be able to put a bow on it, wrap it up in a clear manner, say your thank yous or lead into maybe an upcoming episode So really plan out how you're going to transition out. And then lastly, the thing that I want you to consider is creating space for ads. Now, I know a lot of you, clearly there are 70% of you that don't have podcasts yet, but including ads is something you can do from day one, depending on where you host or what services you use. But if you host with Spreaker, from day one that you deliver your first episode, you can start utilizing our ad program. So it's something I want you to think about, because if you talk, and leave very little room in your podcast for ads, it can be awkward to add them later on. So even if you're like, I want to start podcasting now, maybe I'll think about advertising down the line. I would actually truly encourage you to add, 2 spots. It all depends on how long your podcast is, but add 2 spots where you say, we'll be back right after this break, or however you choose to leave some space, because you want to make sure that you are setting yourself up now, even on day one. If it's day one for you, you want to set yourself up now so that you can grow. So that's just something to consider. I am going to send you guys a PDF download of an outline after the webinar so that you can really fill this in episode to episode. Okay, great. There you go. You got the draft of your episode outline done. Next up is something that it's not going to apply to every single kind of podcaster, but interview style podcasts are one of the most popular styles, right? So I know that finding guests for podcasts is one of the most daunting tasks, probably because if you don't know who you're going to have on your podcast, there are so many questions about where do I find them? How do I ask them, right? Like it's a bit of a scary seeming topic, but I hope that after we end this section, you're going to see that there are probably a lot more ways to reach guests than you thought. It's definitely something that you still have to have patience for, especially as you're growing your podcast. So, definitely be patient with yourself, but know that there are a lot of tools out there to help assist you. So we're going to run through several different ways where you can find an ideal podcast guest. So first of all, especially if you're brand new, I encourage you to tap into your existing connections. I know it's not probably cool or exciting for you to think about having your brother or your cousin or your aunt on your podcast. But the reality is, when you're building your podcast, even from day one, you have the opportunity to prove to be a competent podcaster, a podcaster who brings value to this world. And you can do that no matter who your guest is, if you're approaching it the right way. So if your cousin can speak to the topic that your podcast covers, in those early days, I really encourage you to bring those people on, because not only does it give you just a footprint and of your podcast existing, but it also gives you the opportunity as a host and an interviewer to improve. Also, you can go outside of cousin to mom. Also think about coworkers, neighbors, anybody that's already in your sphere of influence that would be willing to help you out. Idea number 2, attend industry events. Of course, that's not super possible right now. But once you have the opportunity, any chance that you have to get face-to-face with people is a leg up, right? So say you are starting a podcast about comics, right? Likely you're probably already really interested in the subject. So you might know, okay, there's Comic-Con, there are these meetup groups in my city. I really encourage you to go out there and get involved, because even if you don't meet someone and say, hi, will you be on my podcast? You're going to start building relationships with people that down the line will absolutely potentially result in you having more guests and more qualified guests on your show. Number 3, now this is kind of the digital version of number 2, which is very ideal right now. You've got to utilize Facebook groups. Even sometimes you get a little pushback when I say that, because people are like, oh, I'm not on Facebook. For the purpose of this alone, I would get you a Facebook where you're just there to engage in these kind of groups and find guests. Because no matter what your topic is, I can almost guarantee you that there is a very active group on Facebook. You're going to start a podcast about rock climbing. There are thousands of very active Facebook groups with rock climbers, with people that work in the industry, with professionals. So getting in those groups and engaging with people is a really great way to discover guests. Okay, up next, and this is one of my favorite techniques, is find someone who's selling. Okay, people who are selling a product or a book, they're really looking for opportunities to talk about what they're doing. So one of my favorite little hacks is the upcoming book section on Amazon. So you actually go just to the regular Amazon Books tab, but you have the opportunity to sort by release date, and you can see upcoming books. So you know, okay, this author is probably working to promote their book that's launching in a month and a half. And same with other products, you know, searching online for things that are coming out, or anytime you see a new company or new product launch, if it's connected to what you do, those people are going to be eager because it'll be mutually beneficial, right? Not only will you have somebody that's an expert on this specific topic, but they also are getting the opportunity to talk about what they're selling. And especially if they're up and coming and you're new, you know, both of you in your newness can still really pay off because it just gives you another opportunity to practice. Okay, up next, see what your competition is doing. A lot of times you can take the guesswork out of things by hunting around what your competitors are doing, right? So this new feature, you'll see this GIF that's on the screen right now, is actually now how Apple Podcasts is organizing their podcasts. So if you're thinking, okay, I do a history podcast, go to the history podcasts in Apple Podcasts and click through them and scroll to the bottom, and you can see who has been recent guests on those shows. And the thing that's really great about this is not only does it show you people that are experts, but it also shows you that they like to be on podcasts. They're interested and willing to be on podcasts. So it kind of gives you a double whammy. Now, along these same lines is idea number 6. There are actually quite a few services for utilizing finding guests, and Podcast Guest is a well-known one. And then Podchaser is actually also a well-known one. And I want to show you Podchaser. It's a really great tool. So I'm going to pull that up right now. Okay, so Podchaser is actually, it's one of our partners. And you can do all kinds of things on Podchaser, but in short, the name that it's been given is the IMDb of podcasting. And there is so much on this website, especially when you're searching for guests. So first of all, it's another place where you can distribute your podcast, which we're going to talk about at the end. But also, it's a great place to check out all kinds of different things. It allows you to connect with people. It allows you to follow creators. So I'm going to click on Joe Rogan, perfect example. You can follow Joe. You can get alerts of when Joe is on another podcast. And you can also see every single place that Joe has done a guest appearance on. And you can search these creators, is what they're called on here. Joe is a creator. You can search for creators based on their niche, based on their topic. So there's all different kinds of ways to find people who specialize in maybe your podcast topic. And they actually, so not only can you do a lot of just digging by clicking around, following people, typing in all kinds of different things, but Podchaser also just launched something even more specific to this called Podchaser Connect. It's actually in beta right now, but it gives you the opportunity to sign up saying that you want to be a guest or my podcast needs guests or both, and they will actually match you with people in their database. So this is just one of my favorite tools because there's so much in there, so many different options for finding people. Okay, so let me hop back to the slides. So another great way to find podcast guests is once you've had a guest, tap in to their connections, right? So not only should you get familiar with maybe who they know, but keep up with them after you've had them on as a guest. Because if you end up seeing that, oh, like I see my former guest is having these conversations with this person online, you can definitely go back to those people, keep those relationships going so that you can, check in with them and see if they might recommend you or pass your name along anytime you have an idea to connect with someone they know. And then last but certainly not least is ask your audience on social media. Now, of course, this requires a bit of a following, but I love this technique because when you ask your audience to tag you, tag the person they recommend, it starts getting your name and your podcast maybe on the radar of the person they're tagging. So that once you actually reach out, it's not super random. They're like, oh, you know what? I've seen people tagging me and suggesting that I be on this podcast, and they might be more inclined to do a podcast with you. Okay, so now you have quite a few tools on actually um, finding those guests. So now that you've identified some people that you would love to have, let's talk about how you actually reach out to them. Number one, before you reach out to them, you need to know how to express your value as a podcaster, as a person, as a community, whatever you're involved in. You really need to know how to express that value, right? What's your expertise? What's special about your podcast? What value is it going to bring listeners? So I would actually really encourage you to write these questions down and actually answer them. Because if you have all of these questions fleshed out, when you go to write an email to the potential podcaster, you'll be able to pull back on these things. Oh, I have 10 years of experience in this subject. That's why my podcast is filling this gap. You really want to be able to speak to your value. Number two, you want to make your request to them and their benefit from being on the podcast crystal clear. Okay, so right off the bat, you want to make sure that you are very specific about, how long the interview is going to be, what subject matter they're going to be speaking to, what they need to be prepared to speak on. On top of that, you want to be able to offer them something, right? You want to say your podcast size or downloads. Again, these are as you grow. You also want to talk about maybe your value outside of podcasting alone. Do you have a social media following or an email list that you'll be able to promote their podcast episode to? So, really work through those things. And another thing to consider, especially if you're brand new, is simply that it gives them an opportunity if they're an up and coming, maybe author. This gives them a platform just to speak and improve, right? That's another great way for them to sort of, another way that you can advocate for a benefit. Okay, next is on the approaching podcast guest list is engaging with them online. Now, let me just say, this is a bit of a long game, right? If you have someone that you want to have on your podcast, especially if they're more famous or well known or have a large following, commenting on one Instagram post isn't going to probably result right away in them becoming your podcast guest. So you have to think of this in terms of it being a longer game, right? But if you are starting a podcast on your specific subject, more than likely you're very passionate about it, and the people that you're considering having as guests, you really care about who they are and what they have to say. So you're probably already following these people anyways. So if they have a blog or podcast or social media, read that blog, listen, engage with them in a meaningful way. And then again, just like when you have your listeners tag who you want as guests, if you start commenting on things, once you reach out, it's going to potentially create a little bit of familiarity. Now, one thing I want to warn you on is don't go overboard. Don't be creepy. Don't, just really stalk people and comment over and over and over, especially specifically about your podcast. Really think about it as developing a relationship, not making a request. And don't overdo it because you don't want to push people away. Now, last thing you want to do is write a polished email message or message. These are kind of the ingredients that I have listed here that are very important. You want to have a catchy intro. You want to mention your podcast, why you need them, what they get out of it, details on your podcast, previous guests, etc., and an explicit ask. Okay, so once you've done the work on questions 1 and 2, that will give you all the content you need to write a polished professional email that's really compelling and that really sells yourself well. And I know that even with these bullet points, you can maybe still be like, I don't know exactly what that looks like. Another one of the freebies that we're going to send you after this is a template email of how you could approach guests. Okay, we've got the episode outlined. We know how we're going to find guests. And now let's jump into the recording equipment and editing software. This is, man, of course, outside of questions that our customer service team gets about our products, this is the question that people have. This is one of the most asked questions. What equipment should I use? How should I edit my podcast, right? And because there are a lot of options on the market, and I know as a new podcaster, it can feel really overwhelming. Like, am I picking the right thing? Especially if you're spending money, you want to make sure that you're getting your money's worth. And let me just state, there is no perfect piece of equipment or software for everyone, right? Depending on who you are, what your goals are, there's something specifically perfect for you, also with your budget in mind. So first, let's jump into equipment. It can seem a little overwhelming, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So the basic recording setup is some type of recorder, a microphone interface, and headphones. A couple of things to consider before you buy. I want to point out these two important things or tips. One, are you recording alone? So do you plan to have a solo cast, or you're recording you're going to interview people, but you're going to be the only person in the room? If so, you need to use a USB mic. Or if you plan to record with other people in a room and you're going to have multiple mics, you need to have an audio mic. I know I'm getting kind of granular right away, but this is one of the biggest issues that we actually see is a group of people getting together to record and they all have USB mics, and that doesn't work. I'm going to go into more detail, but I want to point it out because sometimes people waste money on one type of mic and then have to go get another. Now, the other thing I want to mention is test out equipment once you have it. Of course, you want to be familiar with the store or wherever you purchase it, the return policy, but this is just like, a shirt. You want to make sure it fits, right? So once you get equipment, get it hooked up, set up, and test it, right? If it works for you, awesome. If it doesn't, you have the opportunity to return it before you start using. That's something that people often don't think about, and they feel like they got stuck with the wrong thing. So I really encourage you early on to test it. So I am going to be giving you quite a few recommendations. You do not need to jot this down because I'm going to share this guide that we've put together with you, but I do want to walk through each element. So on this page, these are the more budget-friendly options for independent podcasters, right? So you want to make sure that you have your headphones. This helps you hear yourself clearly, and this helps you hear guests clearly. If you are an individual who will be podcasting by yourself in a room, a USB mic is a great way to go. Those are often most affordable. And then we have some recommendations for audio mics. This is what you're going to want to use if you're recording with multiple people. And if you are recording with an audio mic, you will need an audio interface. So to put it easily, when you think about a USB mic, the end of the microphone has a USB plug, which can go straight into your computer. But the audio mic needs a box where multiple microphones can go on, and that's what the audio interface is. So just something to think about. Again, I will send you this list so that you can click through, check them out, check out pricing. On this page, we have everything from $70 headphones. The audio mics are somewhere around $200, so from $70 to $200 for the different pieces of equipment. Now, I want to mention before we move on, you don't need these items to start a podcast, right? You can absolutely start a podcast with your phone, press record on the Spreaker Studio app. But this webinar is about really producing something polished. So these are our recommendations if you really want to, make sure that you're presenting something very polished and professional, even if you're an individual podcaster. And for our podcast publishers, or maybe people that just have a really unlimited budget, I'm also going to include these next tier, more expensive, if you really have some money to spend, this is our recommendations. And once again, there are a million recommendations out there, but our head of content, Jonathan, he specifically developed this for you guys. He has been working in recording studios forever, has such a great idea of what is useful and high quality in the price tiers. So stay tuned. I'll be sending these along for you guys to explore and check out. Now, really quickly, I want to just mention some optional things. Those items on the last pages, those are the only things that you need to really produce something polished. But if you have some extra spend and you want to kick things up another notch, you could get a shock mount. Basically, what the shock mount does is it reduces sounds that might move through your mic stand, or if you're holding the mic, the sounds that your hands might make. It reduces that. I do want to mention that most of the time, if you purchase a microphone, there's a specific shock mount that goes with it. So don't just buy a random shock mount. Make sure that you get the correct pair. Then there's a pop filter. I don't know if you've ever listened to a recording, or maybe even listening to me here, or a podcast where those different sounds really are kind of harsh on the ear. The pop filter essentially just reduces that. I think you can get one on Amazon for as little as $7. So I wanted to throw it up there. If you have the money to spend, you might as well grab this, because it's just going to continue to refine your sound. And then here we have the boom arm mic stand. Again, anything you can do to eliminate touching your microphone is going to eliminate unnecessary sounds. So it's something you might want to consider as well. Okay, so let's jump into software. This is, when I say software, I am talking about recording and editing. Okay, so depending on what you're looking to do, there are a lot of different great options out there. So the first one that I am going to mention is Spreaker Studio. It is our desktop and mobile app. We think it's a great product all around, but one of the things that makes it exceptional is for live podcasts. So if you want to do something that's more of a sort of radio style or just live podcasts, Spreaker Studio is one of the absolute best tools on the market for this specific thing. Okay, Audacity is another option. This is a free option. This is probably what you're going to see most newer podcasters utilizing. The great thing about it is, because it's so widely used, you can find a million videos online to help walk you through the process, right? So there's a lot of resources on how to use this tool properly. Now, I want to mention two other excellent tools that are on the more affordable side, in case you already have one of these two things. So if you already have an Adobe suite, Adobe Audition is actually included, and you can utilize this for your recording and editing. And then same with, if you already have a Mac, you can do everything you need to do on GarageBand. And I wanted to just give you a quick glimpse of what the Spreaker Studio app looks like. Here you can see, it's a recording interface, and then there's the live option over here. This is definitely sort of our specialty for the recording app. Now, if you have more money to spend, the sky's the limit. So I want to talk about two of the best products on the market for if you're a podcast publisher. Avid Pro Tools, it's sort of accepted as the industry standard. So it's an excellent choice. But then I also want to mention Reaper. Our head of content loves this tool. It's very, you can get a really high quality production out of this. It has a million different tools and is definitely one of the top ones that Jonathan recommends. Now, I want to also mention, along with software, you need your base where you're going to record and edit. But if you're going to record with someone from afar, which is especially timely right now, you do need to have a third-party tool where you can do that, where you can video and record the two audios at the same time. So our list of recommendations is Squadcast, Zoom, Ringer, and Zencastr. So I would encourage you guys to check those out. I do also want to mention Skype. A lot of people are familiar with that product, and you can absolutely use it as well. But I will say the audio quality tends to not be as high as something like Squadcast or Zoom, But if you're already familiar and comfortable with it, you can absolutely use that. And then you can download the tracks, and edit from there. Okay, so we're 1 through 3. We're chugging through it. You now have the content and the guests prepared to record. You have your equipment. You know what software you're going to record and edit with. And the next step is actually, starting to think about pressing record and editing. So we're going to go over some of our best practices. Okay, first up is recording. This is the really fun part. It's not as simple as just pressing record if you want to produce something really wonderful and polished. So it can be really exciting to finally get to this point because you have to put a lot of work in beforehand, planning things out. But before you press record, I want to share with you guys our top recording tips. So before you go to start a session, I would use these tips sort of as a checklist before you get started. Okay. Number 1, make sure you're recording. I know that seems a little bit silly, but I cannot tell you the amount of times when we ask our podcasters on social media, or actually even in some webinars that we've done before, like, what's your number 1 piece of advice? People always say this: make sure you're recording. I recorded an entire hour-and-a-half interview with someone and I forgot to press record. So whatever you need to do to remember, if you need to write it at the top of your content outline, if you need to put a sticky note on your computer, make sure you press that little red button. Sort of in the same vein of what we already chatted about, make sure you have the proper microphone for the type of podcast. Again, if you're a solo podcaster, you can do USB, but if you're doing something else with other podcasters, you want to go the audio mic route. Before you're recording, you want to make sure all of your devices are plugged in and are charged. Tip number 4, you want to make sure that you have backups, extra plugs, extra batteries. You want to make sure that you are set to go. Number 5, make sure that you and your interviewees are conscious of small noises, right? Your breath, are you breathing heavily in between conversations? Make sure you're clicking mute when you're not talking. If you're interviewing someone, make sure that you're not shuffling your hands on the table. Any of these small noises that you probably maybe haven't thought of before you start recording, make sure that you do those. Also, make sure that you brief your interviewee if you're interviewing someone. Just say, hey, I don't know how familiar you are with podcasts, but I just want to, send along these tips so that we can get the most high quality version of this. Number 6 is don't record cold, right? So be sure to actually warm up your voice because if you have some cracks or creaks that you need to get out, you can get them out beforehand instead of in the middle of a recording. Next thing is avoid referring to visual images that cannot be heard. If you're referring to something that's a visual image, of course you can say it, but make sure you give a description, right? And then also, if you have a podcast website or Facebook group, things that we're going to talk about in the next webinar, make sure that you are sharing those visuals so that if your listeners want to get a fuller picture of what you're talking about, you can say, oh, by the way, check out our Facebook group. We just dropped a picture of what we're mentioning in this podcast. Number 8, make a backup copy of your project. As soon as you stop recording, duplicate that file, save that file to Dropbox or Google Docs or wherever you need to have a second copy so that in case anything happens to the one you're recording or editing, you have a backup. Number 9, sorry, I sort of covered this on the last one, but make sure you stay quiet when your guests are speaking and mute yourself if necessary. I think you will find this potentially one of the most challenging things as a new podcaster if you're interviewing people. I guess it depends a bit on your personality, but oftentimes new podcast hosts really struggle with talking too much, not because they love to talk and love to hear the sound of their voice necessarily, but it's just, you're eager to make sure the podcast goes well. So you want to say things, you want to keep things moving. But sometimes the best thing is just to sit back and really let your guests do their thing, talk about the thing that is their expertise. Tip number 10 is leave an audio cue for mistakes and take notes. right? So one of our podcasters on Spreaker is the one that taught me this tip. So he's a solo podcaster, so he doesn't have guests. But anytime he screws up, he keeps a pin or something to whack the table with. So, oh, I screwed up. He'll hit the pin on there. And later, when he's reviewing the recording, he can see the spike where he messed up so that easily when he goes to edit areas, he can see, okay, I hit my pin here, here, and here. So I can just go right back to it instead of having to listen through to the recording and find those areas that he wants to edit. So I really encourage you to leave some kind of audio cue. It can be a loud noise or it can be total silence for 3 seconds or something like that, because then you can also see the gaps in the recording. This will speed up your editing quite a bit. Number 11, don't be afraid to take a break, even if you have guests on. If you guys are out of breath or you need some water, stop, chill for a second. If that's going to help you really collect your thoughts and move forward in a more powerful way, do that. Okay, lastly, tip number 12, record in a small, quiet room and do what you can to minimize echo. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from podcasters, right? A typical at-home setup is recording in your closet. Your closet is oftentimes the most quiet room that has the least, distance to walls, which is what part of what causes echoing. So I wanted to share a couple of great pictures of closet setups and some really unique ideas. I know quite a few podcasters who every single podcast record under a blanket. I know it's funny, but it does totally, in an inexpensive way, it mutes those noises around you. And then on the other side, you can see this picture of a foam mattress pad. A lot of people do this inside of a box, another cheap way to minimize noise. Now, of course, if you're in a professional recording studio, you don't have to worry about those things. It's padded for noise, but tons of our podcasters, the majority of our podcasters record at home, and finding a small, quiet, still space is absolutely going to produce the best result. Now, if you want to outsource, if you don't want to buy equipment, if you don't want to worry about recording under a blanket, once the world is back to normal, you can absolutely outsource, right? Depending, of course, on your budget, though, you might not need to worry about doing things at home. You can actually just go to, I put up quite a few options, or a couple of options here. We're partners with Staples, and they just recently started renewing some of their stores. The Staples stores now have podcast studios that you can rent on an hourly basis. They just rolled those out in Boston, but I think they're going to be rolling them out in other cities. Then lots of co-working spaces have studios. And then, of course, you have the professional music studio option. But especially the co-working spaces, I've seen very affordable hourly rates. So if that's something you want to do, especially if you have co-hosts and you want to meet somewhere, this is a great, a fun way to record as well. Okay, let's hop on into editing. This is easily the most time-consuming and technical skill set you need to possess to produce a podcast. It definitely takes trial and error, but once you learn how to edit your podcast on your chosen software, it gets so much easier with time. So we're going to run through some of our top editing tips. Remember, there is no one way to edit a podcast. So regardless, or whether your podcast is a solo cast, it's a narrative storytelling podcast, you can do whatever you want, right? That's the really amazing thing about podcasting is it's this creative outlet and you get to shape it how you want to shape it. It doesn't have to sound like a podcast you've heard before. It can be completely unique. So, I really encourage you to brainstorm and think about what you want to do. It does not have to follow the sequence of, it doesn't have to be like This American Life or Joe Rogan Experience, right? You don't have to mimic anyone. You can produce the sound that you want because you can. Number 2 is leave some audio as is. I know I mentioned editing some small parts out. And of course, if you have a fiction drama podcast, you are going to edit it to perfection. But if you have an interview podcast, I encourage you to leave some audio as is, right? Listeners are looking for authenticity. They're looking um, to feel like they're having a conversation with someone. So sometimes just leaving little mistakes here or there, laughs, coughs, like that's okay. Number three is if you're adding in music, make sure you have the proper license for it. I'm going to send along this link where I have a full explanation of the different types of music you can use, you should use, and different services of where you can purchase this, download, and add them right into your podcast. Tip number four, less is more. You don't have to shove your podcast full of sound effects and noises, right? Don't add anything that's unnecessary. Now, that is, of course, a bit subjective, but just I want to encourage you to not feel like you have to stuff it full of all kinds of things, right? If your message and what you're saying is clear and poignant or funny or whatever you're going for, you don't have to add a lot of bells and whistles to it. Tip number five, let your audio cues and notes guide you, right? So if you hit your pen to indicate where to edit, I would also encourage you to record along with the notebook so that when you hit that pen, you're going to say why you're editing it or anything that's going to be helpful for you to look back on while you're editing. Tip number six is learn your software shortcut buttons, and the undo button is your friend. So once you go through the recording softwares and decide on one, you can really get familiar with the different shortcuts that are within the program, and it's going to speed things up big time. Again, if you don't want to do it, you do not have to do it. You can edit, you can outsource your editing. We encourage our creators to edit their podcast just because it really, gets you connected with what you're doing and helps you really understand the process. But at the same time, if you don't have time, you're not interested, you do not have to do the editing. There are tons of options to outsource it. So I threw a couple ideas here on the page. So Resonant Recordings is the company is a podcast editing company. And there are quite a few like them. They have a great reputation in the industry. You hire them right on the website. They can, have different levels of service and ways to edit things. And that might be a great solution for you. Or Upwork and Fiverr are both great websites for hiring people. I really recommend Fiverr. You can hop on there, literally type in podcast editor, and for as low as the name suggests, $5, you can find someone to edit your podcast. Of course, I would say the $5 is the very low end range, but I've seen some podcast editors on Fiverr that are around $30 per episode that have really good reviews. So you can peruse all kinds of different editors, see who you might want to have do this for you. Now, I know that that's a lot, the recording and editing. And, we can't go into all the details of how to edit a podcast because we would spend this whole entire time doing that. So what I wanted to do today is provide you with more resources. So the really great thing about podcasting is this industry is so eager to share. It really is amazing. There are some phenomenal podcast YouTubes. I'm going to share this with you so that you have links to every single one of these people. Tons of free information. If you decide I want to use Audacity to edit my podcast, there are sole pages, YouTubers dedicated to showing you how to do this in videos. Like there are a ton of resources for free to, help you really perfect that editing craft. And then my other favorite resource within podcasting is Facebook groups. I know I've mentioned Facebook groups in regards to a couple of other things, but the podcasting community is one of the best communities I've ever been a part of. I've worked in all kinds of, I used to work in agencies, and I would actually set up Facebook groups for all kinds of different industries. I have never seen a more active, fun, robust group of people in Facebook groups. So we have a Facebook group. It's our Next Level Podcasting and Monetization. We'd love for you to join, but I also include several other options here, along with an Italian group and a Spanish speaking group. The great thing is you can connect with people who have been in your shoes. You can ask questions, you can use the search bar because people have asked a million different questions in there. I guarantee you can find what you're looking for if you hop in one of these and ask the community, because it's a very giving community. People want to share their advice and their tips and their ideas. Okay, so we are making our way through. Because of the technical difficulties, we are running just a couple of minutes behind. So if you want to stick with us, we'd love for you to stay in. It's probably going to take an extra 10 minutes. So please hang in with us. If not, we'd love to answer your questions via email if you have to leave. Okay, so at this point, you have your content planned, your guests secured, and your podcast has actually been recorded and edited. Well, now what do you do with it, right? How do you actually get it to listeners? There's quite a bit of confusion, let me just say, surrounding this topic, because you've probably heard the term RSS feed and hosting and distribution, and all of these things kind of get jumbled, but it's actually a pretty straightforward process. And I'm going to quickly walk you through the hosting section first. So a podcast hosting service is, in short, where you upload and publish your podcast and its episodes, right? So Spreaker, that is our primary function. One of our primary functions is being a hosting platform. Now, this is an important decision, because not only do you need to make sure that your podcast host has all the features and services, like you want to come to Spreaker because we let you monetize, we let you go live really easily. So you want to check into all the podcast hosting services and see what fits you best. I will say Spreaker truly does consider everything in the podcast ecosystem and gives you tons of different tools when you host with us. But it's also important because whoever you choose to host with will also be your podcast's RSS feed home, and that's forever. Now, you can build your own RSS feed, but I'm not going to cover that here today because it's really complicated. You have to, it's not that complicated, but you have to write your own code. You have to host it on your own website. So if you're curious about that, I encourage you to Google it. Otherwise, what the majority of podcasters do is let their podcast hosting platform be the home of their RSS feed. Now, here's what that means. I'm gonna give you the 411 on RSS feeds. RSS feed stands for really simple syndication. It also has some other acronyms, and there's a bit of confusion about it. In short, it is the web address, it is the code that is home to your podcasts. Okay, so I'm going to show you really quickly. So you have your podcast, right? Your podcast, when it is uploaded, goes into an RSS feed. The RSS feed is what is sent along to all of the listening apps, the Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, all the different ones that you choose to distribute it to. And then, of course, that's how your listeners hear your podcast. So, for example, if you host with us, right within Spreaker CMS, you can click on your RSS feed and voila, here it is. Okay, now, if you ever, the really simple thing about RSS feeds is that once it's with a hosting platform, anytime you're ready to distribute, like, you don't have to do anything with this URL, right? If it's contained within the hosting site, when you're ready to distribute, you don't have to be worried about this code, because we automatically send it on to all the apps that you want to distribute to, which I'm gonna show you a little bit more on. So once you upload your podcast, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, but I want to get through the slides in case we have any technical difficulties. But once you upload your podcast episode, from there, you share it to the different listening apps. Now, you can manually do this outside of a hosting platform, but again, the reason you really want a solid hosting platform is so that everything can be done right within the platform. You don't want to have to individually go to Apple, go to Spotify, go to Google Podcasts, go to Podchaser. Instead of having to visit all these websites, if you pick a solid hosting platform, you can do that all within the platform, like Spreaker. So when you upload your podcast on Spreaker, this is what it looks like. Okay, so you finished editing and you have your MP3 file, MP4 file, and you upload it. And as soon as you upload it, after you've connected with all of these sites initially, just one time, it will automatically send out your podcast. Easy as that. And a lot of times people ask, well, do I need to have it everywhere? Do I need to have it on Castbox and Podcast Addict and Apple Podcasts? Here's my recommendation. Yes, the majority of your listeners right now, or when you start your podcast, will likely come from Apple Podcast and Spotify. But people listen on all these other apps. So if you can potentially reach more listeners, there's no downside to sharing them everywhere. And we make it especially easy because we're integrated with more listening apps than any other platform. So you can make sure that no matter where your listeners are, they're finding you and they're finding your podcast super easily. Okay, so now that we can hop out of the slides, I just didn't want to have any issues since we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. I want to just really quickly visually show you what I just explained about hosting. Okay, so here you're going to see what I was talking about when I was discussing uploading, hosting, and distributing. So once you've set your account up on Spreaker, it's going to look something like this. Here's an example of where you find your RSS feed. You upload your new episode, right? So you have your final file that you've exported from your editing software. You add it here. You select your podcast. I want the webinar example podcast, and you click upload. You give it a name. You've already added all of these, description and visuals in previously. And then you simply hit publish now. And it's as simple as that. Because when you first updated your account, or excuse me, when you first created an account on Spreaker, you went through and connected with all of these different outlets. So when you upload your podcast, it's automatically sent to each and every listening app. And we have a really amazing customer service team. So if you encounter any issues or have questions, they can help walk you through the entire process. All right, guys, I hope that you found today's content helpful. We walked through the episode outline, finding guests, finding the right recording equipment and software, all the best tips and tricks for actually recording and editing once you've selected your software, and then getting your podcast out there. So I do really quickly before we press pause or stop the recording, I want to announce that our third webinar is going to be on May 20th. And this is going to cover everything about promoting your podcast. So it's literally going to pick up from right where we left off. You have the episode, it's uploaded, it's out there, but how do you ensure that people actually hear it? And how do you actually grow your listeners? We're going to cover all of that on May 20th. Since you've already signed up and you've been in this podcast, we will be sharing the registration link to your email so that you get first dibs on joining us.